The pounding of fists on the apartment door echoed through the hallway. "Open up, Camille! I know you're in there!" barked the voice of Arnold Crenshaw, the landlord. His face was flushed, a mix of rage and impatience, as he towered in front of the peeling green door, his clipboard clutched tightly in his hand. Inside, Camille, visibly pregnant, stood in the living room, her hands trembling as she packed the last of her belongings. Her swollen belly brushed against the edge of the coffee table as she moved with urgency, her expression a mix of defiance and despair. "You've got no right to do this," Camille shouted back, her voice breaking but firm. "No right?" Arnold sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're 6 months behind on rent, and I've been more than generous, sweetheart. Time's up. I don't care where you go, but you're not staying here." The hallway was crowded with curious neighbors, some whispering and others filming the confrontation. A storm was brewing, but Arnold didn't notice. He was too busy reveling in his perceived victory, his prejudice fueling his actions as much as the overdue rent. "You people always think you can take advantage," Arnold snarled, his tone leaving no question about the venom behind his words. Camille froze, her jaw tightening, and then she spoke, her words cutting through the chaos. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice low but steady. "You have no idea who I am." Arnold Crenshaw's empire was built on dominance and disdain, not just over property, but over people. The self-proclaimed king of tenants prided himself on owning nearly half the apartments in the neighborhood. To Arnold, his properties were not homes for families. They were assets to extract every possible dime. His tenants were mere commodities, replaceable and beneath him. Arnold's mornings began with rituals that reinforced his authority. Dressed in tailored suits, his leather shoes polished to a shine, he inspected his buildings like a drill sergeant. Tenants were subject to his wrath for even minor infractions, and he had perfected the art of intimidation. Notices about maintenance fees, fabricated fines, and sudden inspections were his tools of control. One tenant in particular caught his ire: Camille Grant, a young black woman in her 3rd trimester of pregnancy. To Arnold, Camille's overdue rent was more than a financial issue. It was a stain on his perceived authority. For weeks, he targeted her with harassment, exaggerated noise complaints, unannounced visits, and thinly veiled threats about eviction. "Miss Grant," he said during one such visit, standing in her doorway with a smirk, "rules apply to everyone. Pregnancy doesn't exempt you from your obligations." Camille's tired eyes met his, and she nodded silently, biting back words she knew would only escalate his aggression. The tension was palpable. Arnold relished the imbalance of power, but his hubris blinded him to who he was dealing with. Camille Grant wasn't always a woman on the edge of eviction. Just a year ago, she and her husband, Marcus, had celebrated the news of her pregnancy in their modest but cozy apartment. Marcus, an elementary school teacher, was her anchor, always finding joy in life's simplest pleasures. His laugh had filled the halls, his love making every challenge seem surmountable. But fate dealt a cruel hand. 6 months into her pregnancy, Marcus was killed in a car accident caused by a drunk driver. The loss shattered Camille, leaving her alone to navigate grief, impending motherhood, and financial instability. Marcus's paycheck had been their safety net. Without it, Camille struggled to stay afloat. Her work as a freelance writer brought in just enough to cover groceries and utilities. She prioritized prenatal care, knowing her baby's health came first. But rent, with its mounting late fees, became an insurmountable obstacle. Arnold's harassment only added to her stress. Camille avoided asking for help, determined to fight her battles independently. This decision stemmed partly from pride and partly from her identity as the sister of Evelyn Grant, the city's mayor. Camille had always wanted to carve her own path, separate from her sister's influential shadow. But as Arnold's tactics grew more aggressive, her resolve began to crumble. When Arnold slipped the final eviction notice under Camille's door, it was the straw that broke the camel's back. Camille stared at the paper, her hands trembling. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes. She picked up her phone and dialed the one person she had avoided calling, her sister, Evelyn. "Evie," she said when her sister answered. Her voice cracked, betraying the emotions she had bottled up for months. "I need your help." Evelyn, known for her no-nonsense demeanor, immediately shifted into problem-solving mode. What's going on, Camille? Are you okay? Camille explained everything: Arnold's harassment, the looming eviction, and her fear of being homeless with a baby on the way. Evelyn's initial silence was heavy, the kind that signaled a brewing storm. That man has no idea who he's messing with, Evelyn said finally, her voice steel. I'll handle this. Evelyn's connections in the city were vast, but she wasn't just a politician. She was a fierce advocate for justice. Over the next 24 hours, she mobilized her network. Lawyers specializing in tenant rights, housing advocates, and even the press were brought into the fold. Evelyn didn't just want to stop the eviction. She wanted to expose Arnold's discriminatory practices for all to see. The day of Camille's eviction dawned bright and cold. Arnold arrived at the apartment complex with a spring in his step, clipboard in hand. He had won. Another tenant would be out and he could increase the rent for the next occupant. But as he approached the building, he noticed an unusual commotion. A sleek black SUV was parked at the curb. News vans lined the street, cameras trained on the entrance. A small crowd of reporters and onlookers had gathered, their murmurings buzzing like static. At the center of it all was Evelyn Grant, the city's mayor, standing tall in a tailored coat. Arnold's confident stride faltered. "What's all this?" he demanded, his voice tinged with annoyance. Evelyn turned, her sharp gaze locking onto him. "Mr. Crenshaw, I presume?" she said, her tone calm but laced with authority. "Yes, and you are?" Arnold asked, though a flicker of recognition crossed his face. "Evelyn Grant," she replied smoothly, "mayor of this city, and more importantly, Camille Grant's sister." Arnold's face went pale. Evelyn wasted no time. She addressed the crowd, outlining Arnold's history of tenant harassment and discriminatory practices. "This isn't just about my sister," she said, her voice carrying over the murmurs. "This is about every tenant who has been exploited and mistreated by landlords like Mr. Fitz Crenshaw." Arnold attempted to interject, but Evelyn silenced him with a pointed look. "We have evidence," she continued, holding up a stack of documents. "Falsified violations, illegal inspections, and targeted evictions. This stops today." The crowd erupted in questions, cameras flashing. Arnold's attempts to defend himself only made him look more foolish. Arnold Crenshaw stood motionless as Evelyn's words echoed in his ears. The reality of the situation was beginning to sink in, but his pride refused to let him admit defeat. Reporters surged forward, their microphones and cameras aimed at his face like weapons, capturing every bead of sweat that now glistened on his forehead. "This is a misunderstanding," he blurted, holding up his hands in a futile attempt to regain control of the narrative. "I'm a businessman. I treat all my tenants fairly." Evelyn's sharp, unyielding gaze pierced through him. "Fairly?" she echoed, her voice rising with indignation. "You harassed a pregnant woman, threatened her with homelessness, and neglected the most basic responsibilities as a landlord. If this is your definition of fairness, Mr. Crenshaw, then perhaps the law needs to teach you a better one." The crowd roared in approval. Cameras flashed, capturing the mayor's resolute stance and Arnold's growing discomfort. A few of Arnold's tenants, emboldened by the spectacle, stepped forward to share their own stories of mistreatment. "He charged me for repairs that were never made," one elderly man said, his voice trembling with emotion. "When I complained, he told me I could leave if I didn't like it. He shut off our water for a week last summer," a single mother chimed in. "Said it was because of unpaid bills, but I'd shown him the receipts. He didn't care." The stories piled up, each one adding weight to the case against Arnold. For years, he had operated with impunity, confident that his tenants, many of whom were low-income, elderly, or minorities, lacked the resources or support to challenge him. But now, under the harsh scrutiny of the public eye, his carefully constructed facade was crumbling. Arnold's lawyer, a slick man in a navy suit, arrived on the scene, pushing his way through the crowd. "No further comments," he barked, placing a hand on Arnold's shoulder. "Mr. Crenshaw has nothing to say at this time." "Oh, but I do," Evelyn interjected, stepping closer. Her voice was calm but carried a dangerous edge. "The city has already begun an investigation into Mr. Crenshaw's properties. Preliminary findings suggest a pattern of illegal evictions, fraudulent maintenance fees, and gross neglect of tenant rights. Rest assured, justice will be served." Arnold's lawyer tightened his grip on his client's shoulder, steering him toward his car. "We're leaving," he hissed. Arnold, still too stunned to resist, allowed himself to be guided away. But as he reached the edge of the crowd, he made the mistake of glancing back. What he saw stopped him cold. Camille stood near the front of the crowd, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly. Her face was calm, but her eyes burned with quiet defiance. For the first time, Arnold felt a pang of something foreign, guilt, perhaps, or the dim realization that he had been wrong. The reporters swarmed Evelyn for further comments, but she raised a hand to silence them. "This isn't just about my sister," she said firmly. "It's about every tenant in this city who has suffered at the hands of landlords who abuse their power. We're sending a clear message today: enough is enough." Over the next several weeks, Arnold's world unraveled. The city's investigation unearthed a mountain of evidence against him. Photos of dilapidated apartments, receipts for bogus fees, and testimony from dozens of tenants painted a damning picture. A class action lawsuit spearheaded by Evelyn's legal team quickly gained momentum. Tenants who had once been too afraid to speak out now found strength in numbers. The lawsuit didn't just seek financial compensation. It aimed to strip Arnold of his properties entirely. The media latched onto the story, portraying Arnold as the epitome of greed and corruption. Headlines like "Landlord Tyrant Faces Reckoning" and "Justice for the Exploited, Crenshaw Empire Crumbles" dominated the news cycle. Arnold became a household name, but not in the way he had ever imagined. The financial blow was devastating. Tenants stopped paying rent, emboldened by the ongoing investigation and legal battles. Banks froze his accounts as his assets were reassessed. One by one, his properties fell into receivership, managed by court-appointed administrators who prioritized the tenants' needs over Arnold's profits. Arnold's social life also took a hit. Friends and acquaintances distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his tarnished reputation. The once arrogant landlord found himself isolated, his empire reduced to ashes. Camille, meanwhile, found herself at the center of a movement she hadn't anticipated. Her story resonated with people across the city, shining a spotlight on the broader issue of housing inequality. Evelyn used the momentum to push for new legislation aimed at protecting tenants' rights, ensuring that no one else would have to endure what Camille had. Despite her initial reluctance, Camille became a vocal advocate for the cause. She spoke at rallies and town hall meetings, sharing her experiences and urging others to stand up against injustice. Her strength and resilience inspired countless others, proving that even in the face of adversity, one voice could spark change. Arnold's final reckoning came in the form of a court ruling. The judge, a stern woman with little patience for excuses, delivered a scathing verdict. "Mr. Crenshaw," she said, fixing him with a cold stare, "your actions have not only violated the law, but have also demonstrated a complete lack of humanity. This court finds you guilty of multiple counts of tenant harassment and fraudulent practices. Your properties will be seized and redistributed, and you will face significant financial penalties." Arnold, now a shadow of his former self, stood silently as the verdict was read. His lawyer patted his arm in a half-hearted gesture of reassurance, but there was no comfort to be found. As Arnold left the courtroom, he passed Camille and Evelyn in the hallway. Camille held her newborn son in her arms, her face radiant with quiet triumph. Evelyn stood beside her, a protective hand on her sister's shoulder. Arnold paused as if to speak, but no words came. The two women watched him go, their expressions a mix of pity and resolve. For Arnold Crenshaw, the lesson was clear. Power without compassion is a hollow victory. And for Camille, her fight had proven that justice, though often delayed, was never out of reach. Despite his fall from grace, Arnold sought redemption. Stripped of his wealth and influence, he began volunteering with housing organizations, working to rebuild the trust he had shattered. It was a slow, humbling process, but Arnold was determined to make amends. Camille named her healthy baby girl Grace. With Evelyn's support, she started a nonprofit to help single mothers facing housing insecurity. Her journey from despair to triumph became a beacon of hope for others. As for Arnold, his story served as a powerful reminder that even the most flawed individuals could find redemption through humility and action. Together, they proved that justice and compassion could pave the way for a brighter future.